Functional Herbal Medicine Podcast. We're your hosts, Kristin and David. And today we're going to be discussing herbal strategies for eczema. So I think it's one of the most common chronic skin conditions that we see. And the holistic approach definitely has a lot to offer for people. We definitely see a lot of people trying to heal their skin from the outside in and like really leaning on a lot of topical applications. But as we'll discuss in this podcast today, eczema has a lot of different contributing factors and many layers that can be addressed internally to offer healing really from the inside out. So we'll talk about mechanisms through which eczema occurs, and we'll discuss the most common root causes that we see in clinic, and then we'll talk through some of the herbal strategies that we use to support this condition. So David, would you like to start us off maybe with a little bit about eczema and like what are the common themes that you see in clinic?
Yeah, we see it quite often. It's one of the more common conditions that come through. You know, like we always talk about like stress and sleep is always something so common, but eczema is actually quite common. And maybe it's self-prophesizing or whatever, or maybe I called it into the shop. But back in 2020, I was saying like, if people continue with this using of hand sanitizer and cleansing all these surfaces, we're going to see a huge uptick in asthma and eczema. And we haven't seen a huge uptick in asthma so much, but definitely eczema is like, we're seeing it like crazy. And it's everything from, we've seen like florists come in where they work with flowers and the flowers are agitating. We have hairstylists. So these are, I would say, the common people for sure, right? Like the common people that are working with these things. We'll talk about those things later. They're working with these things that are causing eczema. Ultimately, eczema is an allergic response. So there's like this triad of allergies, asthma, eczema. And yeah, it's an immune response. And one of our teachers kind of told me that it was like a hyperactive immune response in the sense that like you're around your environment, you coming into contact. Let's just use pollen, for example. Our body is supposed to develop some level of tolerance to these things. Like it's supposed to get used to seasonal pollen that's coming out. Like our bodies are supposed to recognize like, oh, that's not a threat. It's just something we see every year. So don't overreact. But through different mechanisms, different aspects of our current environment, the way our world operates, which we'll talk about, our body's immune system just overreacts. It just goes hyperactive mode to this pollen that's not a threat to the body, but is being perceived as a threat. And so ultimately, like the mucous membranes and the skin tissue is the mast cells. Those are like the munchers that just kind of eat things. They're primed with an immunoglobulin that acts as an allergic response. So when the skin or the lungs or the sinus come into contact with something that is perceived as a threat, the immune system fires off these mast cells. And I know you'll have something to say about mast cell stabilization and all that going forward, like what we're going to be talking about herbally. But that's it in a nutshell, right? Like that's eczema. We see it quite commonly at the shop, and it could be from all this over sanitization, but there's so many other factors, not just that.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned this kind of like over sanitization that we saw in like 2020 onward. And you said like we haven't seen a lot of allergy or like a lot of asthma as a result, definitely a lot of eczema. But something that we have seen that you kind of alluded to is this like mast cell activation. It's been linked to long COVID. And so like there's definitely this immune dysregulation that is kind of carrying through for people and lingering and causing like really long-term symptoms. And I definitely think that the over sanitization has like at least in part something to do with that. So we were inside for a lot, we sanitized a lot, and then we get hit with an infection and like people are just not able to tolerate the inflammation that occurs, or like the not able to have the correct immune response in those types of situations. So definitely we're seeing like allergic type conditions expand and become more and more common, but it almost is like it's becoming like less hay fever and more of these like systemic kind of things. So and I think that's just a reflection of like how far we've gotten from our natural lifestyle, how sanitized we've become, how stressful our lifestyles are. You know, there's so many contributing factors in this, but it's like it's getting more and more systemic, kind of these larger reactions. And then like the closer you are, like this more systemic it becomes, the closer you are to fitting into this like mast cell activation category. So we've talked a little bit about that in previous podcasts, but that's kind of like the more extreme end of things. And like David mentioned, like it comes down to immune hyperreaction. Really it's hyperreaction because it's not doing anything wrong necessarily. These are normal immune responses, but they're happening at inappropriate times to harmless stuff in our environment. So yeah, there's like definitely lots of things that we can do to help support and correct these things on like a systemic internal kind of level. And yeah, if you're one of those people who has eczema, you're more likely to develop the asthma or the allergies or these larger things down the line. So the sooner you can support it, the better, for sure. And yeah, definitely these are like on the rise. Like since I I read something like hay fever didn't even exist until the late 1900s, or the late 1800s, the late 19th century. And since then we've seen like a steep rise in all of these things. So, and I again definitely read that there's people out there that are saying we have like a pandemic of allergy now, and in potentially, you know, the next few decades, we're going to start seeing like 100% of kids with some form of an allergic condition. Yeah, so sooner we can support getting back into nature and support all these systems, then hopefully we can stop all of our kids from being allergic one day.
I wonder what that connection is in the late 1800s. Like what changed? You know, we can kind of make connections throughout time to, you know, it's not scientific based, it's more like anecdotal, clinical observation. But what changed right around then that we started becoming allergic to our environment? I'm going to look into that after. It's pretty cool information.
I was doing a little bit of reading about it, and so without going into too much detail, it was like right around where our sanitization practices changed. But we were actually having cleaner environments and like cleaner water and that kind of stuff. So you'd think that it'd be a positive thing. It probably was a positive thing in the like in the realm of infection or like other types of diseases. But yeah, in terms of like our microbiomes and our mucosal barriers, that's when it started to break down. Part of that I think is just that like we weren't living in natural environments anymore. And we were starting to sanitize our water, starting to sanitize our environments. And then there's definitely like another stair step that happens somewhere in like the middle of the 20th century. So like in the mid 1900s when TV was invented. And apparently, who knows about the correlation? Correlation doesn't necessarily equal causation, but there was a noted thing where like TV was invented, people were spending all of their time indoors, and now we have like hay fever and asthma that's all increasing. So there's definitely a huge piece with the environment in the increase of the allergies. So maybe let's talk about, like, do you want to go move into some of our underlying causes? We've obviously already alluded to some of those, but should we move into those now?
Sure. Yeah, I'll kind of run through the list maybe, and then maybe you pick the one that's kind of like on your mind. We kind of talked about it before the show, but for sure, let's just go through the list and see where this aligns up for people. And some will be, you know, it's so funny when we talk like holistically with people, because so often it's a lot of the same core stuff, and you'll hear it and all kind of, you know, it's a lot of the core things with almost all conditions. But so specifically for eczema, poor skin barriers is what we alluded to earlier. You know, this is where we're coming into contact with stuff that's breaking down the skin barrier. shampoos, detergents, chemicals, that type of reaction. So, or hand sanitizer. Poor gut integrity. So this is the microbiome environment Kristin was talking about. Diet, environment. So the pollen, animals, dust, mold. That's kind of like, where do we spend most of our time as a Western culture? Most of our time spent inside buildings, and that's not how we evolved. We've spent most of our time in nature. And then these things accumulate inside these environments, and we have a reaction to them. Over sanitization and stress. These are kind of the main highlights, and right back to the core three: microbiome, diet, and stress are kind of like in almost all things that we talk about at the dispensary for sure. But what about you? What's your main focus in this, and mast cell activation and everything?
Mm-hmm. So before I say that, I do want to just touch quickly on like how you mentioned that these things that we talk about as like being like underlying factors, like it's so similar in all of them. And I actually hope that that's something that people take away from listening to our podcast. If they listen, like week after week, episode after episode, I'm hoping that people start to realize that like some of these fundamental things, like they're present in almost all conditions. So it's like you don't actually have to guess on like what it is that you need to do in order to build the right foundation for your body to get healthy, because it's the same. Like we need a healthy gut, we need healthy barriers, we need a healthy immune system, we need to manage our stress and live like a more natural kind of life. It's eat natural foods, unprocessed natural foods. It's the same. So I hope that people are taking that point away, and being able to apply it into any health condition that they do have, because it is like the fundamentals are the same across the board. But yeah, so when it comes to eczema, some of like the thing that I geek out on, I'm really interested in, is this kind of like our barriers. I think it's like a very important thing across many conditions. Again, like something like autoimmune, like we look for solutions, but it's like fundamentally we need to heal the gut barrier, heal the skin barrier. So and I think that our healthy mucosal barriers, that's not just the skin and the gut, it's also like the eyes and the in our mouth and in our sinuses, in the vaginal canal, right? Like in all of these areas we have mucous membranes, we have immune cells, and we have microbiome. So it's kind of like we need strong barriers across the board. And the barriers and the microbiome are kind of inseparable. So it's kind of all one point essentially. So yeah, so in terms of the skin, the actual physical barrier, like, so that exists on the inside of the body, our immune cells are there, and on the outside, our microbiome is there. So it's kind of like we have this like three-tiered, let's call it like our first response, our front line, if you will, I guess.
Yep.
Yeah, so we have this like three-tiered, and each needs to be in place for a healthy immune response and to be able to kind of navigate challenges in our environment. So first of all, for the skin to be healthy, it needs to be slightly acidic. It needs to have lots of fats that hold in the moisture. Our skin is, each cell is made out of fats, but then our skin in particular has different fatty compounds, one of them being ceramides. If you're familiar with like the skin, the kind of like dermatology industry, some moisturizers and stuff have ceramides in it. It helps to repair the skin barrier, because that's a natural thing in our skin that we actually need. It's these fatty things will help to maintain moisture inside the skin, and then we also of course need to have this balanced microbiome. And unfortunately soaps and detergents negatively affect all of these things. So soaps are literally like, they have to be alkaline by nature, so it'll disrupt the pH of your skin. They, by nature, they kill microbes, which is essentially what their goal is, but it will then disrupt the microbiome on the skin. And as well, like, part of the way that soaps work is to break down fats, to break apart fats, And that's what allows, like, like oily, greasy, dirty stuff to be washed away. But again, it's breaking down our natural fatty barrier in our skin, so you end up losing a lot of moisture. And if you can think of like I don't know, like a rubber band or something, that like a brand new rubber band that's had like, it has lots of moisture in it, and it's stretchy, and it kind of, when you stretch it, it bounces back into its normal shape. But when it gets old, it becomes like the moisture becomes less in it, and it becomes kind of more crusty and less flexible. And like this is what happens to our skin when we don't have like the fatty moisture in it. It becomes less flexible. It becomes easier to damage, and then like leaky gut, it becomes leaky. Like our tight junctions in our skin become leaky, and this is actually said to be one of the first things that occurs in like a immune disruption. So it's said to start actually with the skin barrier as babies. So I think you probably have more information on this than I would, but we're born with like a fatty layer on us, and immediately like it's wiped off, and like we're like cleansed and sanitized, but it's like we need those fatty things. So that's actually like one of the first places that our immune system becomes disrupted. And then we break the skin barrier in all other ways, like we just normally use detergents on our clothes and on our skin and in our lives. And we also break the skin barrier with vaccinations and other kinds of medications. So these are all going to contribute to immune issues down the line, and and part of that is with the microbiome. So there's studies that show that a less diverse microbiome with higher counts of like certain pathogenic kind of strains is correlated with an increase of risk for developing eczema. And then of course that includes all of the other allergic stuff that we've been talking about too. And yeah, really this comes down to over sanitization. And there's like a whole theory that goes along with this. It's called the old friends hypothesis, and it's kind of like it really just highlights that in certain environments, or like indigenous populations, they have these different kind of microbiomes. They have actually more parasites, they have more old and ancient kind of infections, but they are less allergic to things. They have stronger immune systems in other ways. So so I think that those two are intricately connected, and the more that we over sanitize, the more we're like breaking down our barriers, and we're breaking down these microbiomes. And I like to think of like the microbiome as like an old growth forest kind of thing. So it's like, if you can imagine your skin or your gut or whatever being like an old growth forest, and it has this whole ecosystem and these big trees and like amazing soils, and it's kind of like all in balance, right? Like it doesn't need humans coming in and gardening it like our backyards do, right? Like we don't need to go out and weed the forest, because it kind of keeps itself in balance in a way. And that's what like an untouched microbiome should be, and both in the gut and on the skin. But like I said, we ruin these in many, many ways. So it's like, if you go and clear cut this old growth forest, which is what we're doing with antibiotics and all like our soaps and whatever, and then the first thing that grows back is weeds, right? It's opportunistic stuff that doesn't need correct soil structure and whatever. It's we have the unfavorable stuff that is growing back. So the more we've disrupted the soil, the more we're likely to see like invasive species move in, and that's kind of like the same thing that happens in your gut and your skin. So the difference is that most of us aren't starting with the robust microbiome anymore. Like most of us are starting with a compromised microbiome, so we're already kind of in a less than ideal position, and then we do take antibiotics, and we cleanse ourselves and whatever. And so each time we're doing something like antibiotics, we're clear cutting our our ecosystem in our body and leaving all of our terrain, not just the gut, but the skin, the sinuses, all of the terrain to these opportunistic bacteria that will either cause infection or cause immune dysregulation, cause these kind of more antibodies to be formed versus like we have these T regulatory cells that kind of manage what's supposed to be the immune response, right? Manage them and keep it under control. And those don't get formed in the same way when we don't have the right exposures. So a long-winded way of saying that the microbiome is essential, and essential not just in like our adult life, but in our early life too. And like our microbiome starts in our early life, if not with our parents.
Definitely something I wanted to kind of bring up, since you alluded to babies and children, is our first microbiome, the way it's supposed to be at least, our first microbiome actually comes from the vaginal canal. As the baby's being birthed, that's their first exposure to the environment around them. That's where they get the microbiome. So like you said, we can kind of scale this all the way back to even the birthing process. And so if you take the modern way, and I don't like traditional or conventional in these methods, I like the modern way of birth. You're in a hospital, over sanitized environment, which, just like you said, the weeds tend to grow up there. You get a lot of MRSA and stuff at the hospitals, right? Mm-hmm. So over sanitized environment, 30% of births in the West, so Canada, US, is C-section. So right there, 30% of children are not getting the vaginal birth canal microbiome. And like you said, I forget what the name of that little fatty layer that you're talking about on the skin is, but it's their prerogative to wipe that off immediately as the baby comes out. So now the baby doesn't have that protective barrier. That fatty layer is actually supposed to like absorb into the skin and like nourish the skin and protect it. And yeah, so 30% of children C-section, and then most children born in the hospital are getting this over sanitization from birth in an environment that they're completely new to, right? So it's quite amazing how we've done exactly what you said, where we go into the forest and we're like, I know better how this forest maintains itself, and we know how to upweed this and plant this, and then what people don't realize is downstream things start going off because they're messing with the environment up here rather than letting nature take its course.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I think the last thing I want to say about the microbiome is I've seen a lot of stuff recently about parasites and parasite cleanses. I feel like parasite cleanses is becoming super trendy and like almost like mainstream in like the functional medicine world anyways. A lot of people out there doing parasite cleanses, and so there's, I don't know, I sort of feel a little bit on the fence about them. I think there's a time and a place to do parasite cleanses or to overhaul your microbiome, because again, we're not really starting with the correct amount. Like, we're already starting with a lot of weeds, so yeah, we need to adjust the microbiome in order to like be the right composition. But I feel like parasites in particular get a bad name, like they're unequivocally bad, and I just don't, that's just not the case, because we have pathogenic parasites. I mean, parasites are really like referring to worms, but we also have little worms called nematodes that are like they're essential in the proper balance of things. They're part of like the predators of the microbiome. So again, like the forest example, like if you were to just like kill all the wolves, we'd have a deer problem, right? So like if you kill all the parasites, you're gonna have another problem. So yes, there's a time and a place for parasite cleansing, and interestingly, like these IgE antibody reactions that are associated with allergy, they were actually originally thought to have evolved as a defense against parasites. But like parasites does not only mean or parasites doesn't necessarily equate to bad, is what I'm trying to say. Parasites, they're incredibly common, and like I think our Western world has been taught to think that parasites only exist in third world countries and like we've completely eradicated them. And like while that is true on some level because we have done a lot of eradication, again, that doesn't necessarily mean a good thing. So because they are totally a part of a normal microbiome on some level and in the right ratios. Yes, you can have a parasite overgrowth, absolutely, but we do need them on some level in a certain ratio compared to the other bacteria in the gut or on the body. It's all part of an ecosystem, right? So, and yes, an overgrowth can cause allergies, and yes, there's a place for parasite cleansing, but like I want people to start thinking about getting away from this idea of like kill all of the bugs, or saying that like just because this one thing is there, it's unequivocally bad, and it's just not the case. So normally parasites are in the body because, well, one, part of a normal microbiome, but two, they'll become overgrown because of something, not because they just exist, but because there's something, whether they have a large source of food inside your body, and that could be heavy metals. They tend to feed on heavy metals. So if you have even like iron toxicity or any sort of heavy metal toxicity from your environment, you're more likely to have an overgrowth of parasites. Technically, that's a good thing. They're there to clean up your environment. So there's other things to consider other than just killing the worms and getting them out. And like, again, we just want to get away from this like over sanitization and killing things because we think that our bodies are supposed to be sterile. They're not. And in many cases, like, parasites have actually been found to be protective, like I mentioned earlier, against the allergic response. They're considered to be part of our quote unquote old friends. So in a hunter-gatherer group that you would have found, like, they would have had plenty of parasites in correct proportions to all of the other things that are going on. So just think about that before you start your parasite cleanse. It's not to say that you don't need one. Maybe you do, and maybe maybe it's a reasonable and seasonal thing to do, but I've just seen a lot of people get really stuck in the like, oh, there's something in my body and I need to kill it, and there's so much more to like altering your microbiome than just taking antimicrobials or antibiotics or those kinds of things. So there's a killing phase, and then there's also like the rebuilding and the healing is just as important as kind of bringing the microbes down into better numbers. But yeah, I just want to say that because I feel like I've seen a lot of parasite cleanses, and I've seen a lot of people just come through and just want to like kill all of their bugs, or just keep killing, and it's there's so much more to it. So if you find yourself in that position as a listener, then definitely seek some support. And I think there's lots of ways that you can go about doing it, but I feel like people are often given the like kill model and not the like what to do after or what to do instead or how to support that along. So that's kind of my note on parasites. They are not all bad.
Yeah, we've seen it at the shop too. Definitely coming through. One caveat that I'll add as well, look into the companies that you're buying your parasite cleanses from too. So, if we're actually in clinic and somebody comes in and they're like, yep, I have threadworms. I've seen them. They're coming out in my bowel movements. The dosages we're using for like getting rid of threadworms are pretty high dose of like certain herbs. I'm not going to list them because that's not our topic, but I've seen some of these parasite cleanse companies. So these companies are developing, maybe with good intentions, I don't know, but their dosages and like the amount of herbs they're using are just small and not what we would be using for an actual cleanse of parasites in the digestive tract, for example. So just keep your eyes on that as well. Seek out a herbalist that knows what they're talking about, because they probably will use different herbs, higher doses of herbs, stronger herbs, after they've gone through the clinical observations and questions as well.
Mm-hmm. That's a super good point. Okay, so I guess next, I would say, we've talked a little bit about microbiome and barriers, and mentioned that soap and detergents are one of those. I mean, another thing, once your barrier becomes disrupted, then you become that much more susceptible to being sensitized to the other things in your environment, of course. So, pollutants and chemicals in your environment. One thing that I find incredibly interesting and fascinating is that most of our indoor air quality these days is way, way worse than our outdoor air quality. So, if you're an allergic person, as spring comes around, pollen's in the air, you find yourself closing your windows. Your indoor air pollution is actually worse than the outdoor. So make sure you have yourself a air purifier. That's what I'm looking for. The air, an air purifier inside, to support your indoor environment. And then watch what you're cleaning with, right? If you're cleaning with chemicals that have artificial scents, or you clean with a lot of bleach, or these kinds of things, really harsh detergents in your house, these can obviously off gas and cause a lot of respiratory distress, which you may not actually experience it as respiratory distress. You might experience it as eczema, for example, because that's how your immune system has become sensitized. So so your environment definitely plays a huge role. One of the things that I'm really interested in that I notice has played a massive role in eczema is mold in the environment. So we have here in Victoria, we have definitely a kind of a damp, heavier, kind of feel to the air. Often above, high humidity levels. And if your humidity inside is anywhere above 50% consistently, you have a chance of mold growth. So dehumidifiers are important. And then again, those, the air purifiers. But I had an experience where I moved into a moldy rental house unknowingly, and within a few months within a few weeks I started developing eczema, where I don't get eczema. I don't really have a lot of skin conditions. I do have a tendency towards allergies, but not on the skin. But it was anywhere I was having contact with jewelry, or anywhere where my skin, if I washed my hands a lot, anywhere where I was my skin was starting to feel it was getting a little thin, I'd break out in those areas. So if you are dealing with chronic allergy, chronic eczema, and it seems to be correlated with when you moved, or seems to be worse when you're inside the house, you seem to be itchier inside the house, mold is a big culprit for one of those things. And it can just be even it can just be one of those things that just adds, right? It's when it comes to allergy, we kind of have an allergy bucket. It can just add to the allergy bucket so that it becomes overflowing and becomes not so much tolerable anymore. So definitely environment, you're not just when it comes to chemicals and pollution, but also when it comes to mold and these kinds of things. And I do want to say mold doesn't necessarily discriminate. It's just because you have mold in your house, it doesn't mean that you've been an unclean or dirty person. It's it is attracted to our houses are made out of drywall. Our houses are made out of mold food, and so when they get damp, which can just be a large above 50% humidity in the air, your bathroom with the shower on gets lots of humidity in there. So it doesn't mean that you've been slacking on your cleanliness in your house. It can just sort of be because of the environment has just been suited towards mold growing then in that situation. So definitely keep an eye out for mold. Check under your sinks, check places where you could potentially get water damage. Make sure you stay up on top of your house maintenance and stuff, because that can really, it can be sneaky, it can be hidden, and it can really mess with you. So definitely something to keep in mind. And I guess the last one on our list here is stress. Do you have any thoughts on that? Anything to add there?
The only thing I can say is, stress is a driver for many things, but one of the most recent eczema clients we've had at the shop, I kind of asked them, like, do you know, like, what's a driver, what's a trigger for this? And the first thing she said was stress. Like, stress, when stress happens, it gets worse. Doesn't mean when we do like a herbal approach, we're not doing immune modulators, anti-allergic type herbs, but we're definitely emphasizing on the stress component, helping to downregulate the system. There's lots of different things you can do to reduce stress. We don't, in that Western approach you were talking about with parasites and microbes, it's just like nuke them, kill them all kind of thing. And stress, people kind of want to do the same thing, right? Like they want to just like nuke the stress. They just want something to eliminate my stress. And the real support for stress is getting to the underlying cause. Like, what is the driver of the stress? Sometimes it is circumstantial. It's just things that are happening in the world that we're in these days. And sometimes it's an underlying like kindling that's taking place, where it's something that's been happening for years based off of trauma, or getting to that underlying cause for stress is the long-term solution versus just nuking the stress with anxiolytics. Again, herbally, we would put in stuff there to help modulate the stress response. We might have anxiolytics, but we would also be putting in plants like ashwagandha, which helps with the long-term support of stress. So stress is a driver for so many things. I think we're all kind of overstressed in different ways. It used to be the tiger in the forest that we were anticipating when we were out there. Nowadays, it's like a paper tiger that's invisible and we can't see it, but we're still scared of it, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's a connection between stress and histamines. So when we're stressed, we release more histamines. Our mast cells are less stable. So you have a higher tendency towards allergy when you are stressed, and that tends to be like a vicious cycle. So like histamine is stressful to have in the body. It's a stimulant. So, like you're stressed, you release more histamine as a result of being stressed out by your environment. And then that histamine causes a stress on the body, and then you release more histamine and more stress. So it's like this a vicious cycle. So one, getting your allergy under control, but also managing stress, and that can look like a lot of different things. If you need support with that, we did a whole episode on the HPA axis. I think that was episode 2. So definitely go and check that out, because again, stress is it's a complex topic for sure, and it can be perceived, but it can also be you can have wellness stress. You can be stressed out by your wellness routine. Or I feel like I'm now seeing a lot of people with wellness world baggage, where they think that they're supposed to intermittent fast, or they're supposed to not eat any carbs, and exercise fasted in the morning. That's to me the worst thing. I feel like these the wellness world can really these things that we think we're supposed to do end up really stressing your body out. So go check out episode 2 if you need some stress support. And then like David said, we have herbal support as well. So but if you've listened to us long enough, you'll know that lifestyle stuff is just as important as implementing the herbs. So maybe let's talk really quickly about some conventional treatments. What are people offered? So if someone were to have eczema, go to their doctor, what does someone walk away with when they try and go the conventional route with eczema?
Totally. And I mean, even they don't even have to go to the doctor anymore these days. They have a lot of over-the-counter versions of these, and then as things get worse, or if it's very aggressive, then the doctor will do something stronger. So steroid creams, hydrocortisone, and then Benadryl, antihistamines. Benadryl is the older version of the histamine blockers. There's newer ones that are less sedative. I can't think of any names on them really, but ultimately steroid cream is phenomenal. When it comes to antibiotics and steroids, I'm a big proponent in very extreme situations for these remedies. They're just overused all the time. You go into the doctor and you have a cold and you're like, my throat's sore, and they're like, well, we'll do a strep throat culture, but start these antibiotics just to be safe. And or you're like, oh, I have this little itchy patch on my hand, here's a steroid cream, throw it on there. And these things are really strong and they're really effective when we need them. But for the smaller cases of like an eczema, all you're doing in the long term with a steroid cream is weakening those barriers. That they're getting thinner. There's long-term effects with steroid creams, especially if they decide to go internal steroids. Like that's systemic, not localized. So I'm a big proponent of steroids and antibiotics when they're used in the proper situations. You know, if somebody's got a super bad lung infection, herbs won't do what an antibiotic will do. One story with a steroid cream. So when our daughter was born, she was a free birth. So we did it at home, and you know, we did all the stuff that we kind of thought was right. You know, we left that layer on her, didn't clean her right away. We gave it a day or two, but we noticed her legs she kept her hips back and her legs up, and we didn't notice. So when we changed her diaper one day, we were kind of like, oh, why are your legs up? So we kind of pushed her legs down a little bit, and some of the birth was left inside of her hips, and it was just really raw, really red. And we're like, this needs something more than calendula oil. And I went to a local health food store, and the guy's like, go to the pharmacy, just ask for a steroid cream. They'll have it in a certain ratio. And literally after one day of application, it went from like super angry red to super relaxed. And then once it calmed down, then I moved into the herbal stuff. Like I didn't just keep throwing steroid cream at her just because I had it. I just used it for that extreme situation, calmed everything down, and then moved into the herbal support. And I think that's kind of, you know, that's the benefit of what's happening with this world and herbal medicine is people are finding that there are other options. You know, there's so much, we've for so many years have been put on this path of there's only one therapeutic, and it's through the pharmaceutical industries, through conventional doctors. And you know, the hippies back in the day, they knew about herbs and they knew about herbalists. And you know, you might have been one of those kids with a crazy mom or dad that was taking you to tarot card readers and getting you herbs when you were a kid. Nowadays, like that's starting to become the norm. We're starting to see average Joe and Jill come through and they're using herbs because it's a very good approach without a lot of the major side effects that come through these things. So that's my spiel on like a steroid cream. Antihistamines, I've had bad experiences personally with them. I'm not a big fan of them really. I just don't use them. I think they make the problems worse in the long run. What about your thoughts on antihistamines?
Yeah, so I appreciate your story that you shared because I feel like that's a really good like reference for parents or for people that's like, yes, use these in an acute setting and then transition off of them, right? Once you're out of the woods, once you're out of the place where you're like, ooh, this is bad, you know, support it naturally or as best as you can in other ways, because these really are like, they're not good long-term solutions. Steroid creams are incredible. They work instantly. Like they're so fast acting, and they crush inflammation. They're really good at what they do, but they're really not good long term. Like they can really, like internally, they can really mess up your adrenals long term, which has like so many downstream implications. Like you mentioned, David, like they thin out the skin, they'll ruin they'll ruin the barrier even more. Like if you have eczema, you already have a compromised skin barrier, you already have something going on right there, and then you know, long term using the steroid creams, you're just breaking that barrier down even more. And there are people that have been on steroid creams for a long time that you know, then want to come off of them, and they have major withdrawals. Like they're essentially, steroids are addicting, not in the sense of like your body will, your mind will crave them, but you'll have major reactions, withdrawal reactions after coming off of them, where you have these huge flares. And the same is true actually with antihistamines, because they can make the situation, like they can make your day a whole lot better if you need them in a moment. But long term, they can really harm your gut. They can harm your ability to break down histamine and to be able to tolerate it in the future. So again, you become more, like by taking these long term, you become more and more reactive. I have like my own personal health journey involves both long-term steroid use and long-term antihistamine use. not in the context of eczema. So I'll tell the stories another time. But yeah, really, like they're addictive because they're amazing and they work, and you're like, oh, that's like, the relief is so good. But yeah, they're really like, you gotta watch your use long term, because like in the long run you can really end up doing you can kind of dig yourself into a hole, I guess, because it's not necessarily that you're doing, I guess you're not doing like long-term physical crazy damage, but you are like, you're reducing your body's ability to manage things in the future, and coming off of them is hard because you get flares. And that, like, it's like when you're having the flare, it's like that much, it feels that much worse than it did before. And it's like, it's those moments where you feel like you desperately need the thing, but it's like using the steroids or the antihistamines is just going to continue to drive those processes. So, yeah, I think that, like, the story you shared was really great, because it gives people a context in which, like, it's not to say don't ever use them, but to say, like, use them carefully as needed, like in the right context, and be aware of all the other things that you can do to support. And like, maybe maybe for a lot of people these don't have to be the first line of defense, right? Like, of course, if you get to a point of like where things are bad and you like need that acute support, then I'm glad that we have these things, and I'm glad that they're there. But for somebody with like a chronic condition, these are really just, they're not super suitable. So yeah, there's lots and lots of other things that you can try in order to kind of manage things and heal things too. Like, not just manage symptoms and slap band-aids on and feel better temporarily, but to also like strengthen that skin barrier, build up your microbiome, manage your immune response, get your immune system a little bit more settled down, and yeah, really actually gain a quality of life back. Whereas it becomes like you have to dig yourself out of a hole if you've used antihistamines and steroids chronically, unfortunately.
That's the case with a lot of pharmaceuticals. They put you in a position where you need them forever, for example, and steroid cream and Benadryl, and it's just a common thing I see across the board with pharmaceuticals, is they dig holes and then you're dependent on them. Going away from them, things get worse for a short period of time, at least, maybe long term. But
well, that's, I think, the difficult part is, it's like when we're dealing with chronic conditions, it's like you get told that you have to be on antihistamines or steroids literally for the rest of your life. Like, it's like that's the one option you have. But let's say, like, so my situation, again, is totally different, but I was like a 21-year-old person and being told that I was going to have to be on these medications for life, and it's like, whoa, I don't know about that. Like, that's actually was one of my first motivations of getting into the holistic, getting into holistic healing and whatever, was like, I'm not going to be on these medications for life. And unfortunately, it's just like they don't have any long-term options. That's all they've got. So yes, use them if you need them, but please do explore your other options, as I'm sure you are, because you're here and listening to this. Yeah, so maybe let's go into some herbal strategies, herbal protocols, and then we can, even talk about some of like the herbs that we use and that kind of stuff. So where do you start with people with eczema usually?
Usually there's the start with like observation. So quite often, if it's a non-sensitive area, I say, can I see it? So I can kind of get a gauge of what level the eczema is at. And quite often, a lot of the approach is the same. It's more getting to those deeper levels. So when I do herbal formulas for people, like we have the main complaint, then we have like symptomatic support, but then we get to the underlying levels of like secondary conditions, underlying health conditions, tonics that the body needs. So that's like rebuilding the body. So we have all these different layers. It's a lot of the same herbs that I use for the immune response and the anti-allergic aspect. And then it's like what's that trigger? What is causing it? Is it stress? Is it because you have a dog and you know you have an allergy to a dog, but you let the dog sleep on your pillow every night and your face is on that pillow? You know, removing exposure is always in a recommendation. I kind of give that caveat because I don't want to sell people a magic pill. That's a big pet peeve I have in the herbal world, is they're like, do this for 30 days and your hair's going to start regrowing. And I'm like, yeah, I haven't seen that with working with herbs this way. And I haven't seen that with a lot of herbs. So I want to be real with them and say, like, these herbs work, the cream works, but removing what's causing the trigger is a major component, like finding that driver. If you're doing a 60-hour work week because you're some tech giant working in the industry and you have eczema and stress is a major driving factor, like, we can throw herbs at it and it might help a bit, but you know, if stress is the main driver, you have to find a way to reduce that stress. So that's always a big component. And then, you know, the microbiome gut flora component, I only really address that when there's that acknowledgement of a digestive problem. However, I know herbalists use that. That's always an approach, and rightfully so, looking at our therapeutics. But maybe, where do you go? Like, is that a big component of your practice?
Yeah, so I think, I don't know, I think that everyone's a little bit different, right? I think that, like we've discussed, there's so many layers to allergy, but specifically eczema. So we can't necessarily just say, like, we can't just address it with a single strategy, like how the conventional says, like, oh, let's just slap some anti-inflammatories or whatever on it. Like, you can do that with herbs, but, well, one, they're not as strong as steroids, so it won't necessarily be as effective, but like, there's so many layers, so there's really, like, multiple places that we could look at. And like you say, like, it depends on the person, right? Depends on if they have significant gut disruption. Although I usually assume that there's some level of, like, a microbiome disruption at least somewhere, even if it's not showing, like, you know, even if the person isn't having, like, an acute infection, usually there's some kind of disruption going on, because we just live in the world that we live in, and most of our microbiomes are not robust and complete necessarily, of, like, all sorts of, you know, diversity, different kinds of strains, and you know, all that. So yeah, there's kind of lots of different layers, but what I do see for sure is that a lot of people come in looking for topical support, but as we discussed, it goes a lot deeper. So there's usually it's usually part of an overall strategy for me, but most often it's like, you know, we do the symptom management, yes, but also like I think of repairing the skin barrier. So yes, microbiome is a part of it. Here's like what I usually will look at for people is, like, so yes, removing the exposure to whatever allergen it is, and that can be like you mentioned, the dog. It could be something in your environment, right? It could be like mold, getting out of a moldy environment. But it could also be switching your detergents out, like your laundry detergents, for something that is more gentle. It could be actually ditching soap altogether. There's there's a whole world out there of people doing all sorts of things. So there's people that are like washing instead of with soap with apple cider vinegar to like maintain the acidic pH, and you know, like the apple cider vinegar with the mother, so you're also adding to your skin microbiome. People have like had massive changes in their skin health as a result, just so that, because the skin barrier can actually heal itself when you start to take away the things that are degrading it. So yes, reducing the exposure to whatever is contributing, whatever is driving it. I usually always focus on nourishment in some capacity, like we said earlier. Like, this is not necessarily we're not creating new things here with this condition. Like, I go to nourishment and everything, really, because if there's some level of breakdown, there's probably like a breakdown of like a physical something. There's usually a reason that is rooted in we're not getting enough nutrients in our diet, or we don't have enough of a specific thing in order to repair properly. Like like you can't build new tissue and repair it if you don't have the building blocks to do so. So nourishment is a big factor, and that will include a lot of like good healthy fats, because we want to get healthy fats back into the skin barrier. I think it's changing a little bit now, but probably, I don't know, even 10 years ago, we were all afraid of saturated fats, and everyone was having like those polyunsaturated fatty acids, the unsaturated fats, so our vegetable oils, canola oil, like all these things, they were deemed heart healthy and good for us. And okay, that's the biggest lie we've ever been told. And so actually getting healthy saturated fats into your diet. I mean, each of our skin cells has, or each of our cells is made with a fatty layer. So I don't know about you, but I want to be building my skin cells and all of my cells in my body with robust saturated fats that don't go rancid, rather than really fragile things that are heat sensitive that go rancid. Like I don't want fragile things to be building my cells, so I get lots of good healthy saturated fats in there. So I think that's a really big component. And then of course, like in terms of a herbal strategy, always some type of supporting the allergic response. So echinacea is great, reishi is great, astragalus. One of my favorites is Chinese skullcap. It's a mast cell stabilizer, and it's incredible. It does like 1,000,000,001 things. We could do a whole episode just on that one herb. But it like supports liver function. It opens the lungs. It does a lot of really beneficial things for the body. And then feverfew is another one of my really favorites, and it's great if you like have. So these are all great if you have the kind of the systemic picture going on, and like if you get allergic type migraines and that kind of stuff, that's a really awesome herb. And yeah, so I'll look at not just bowel flora, but also like the skin flora. So like that obviously goes along with supporting the skin barrier and removing the soaps and that kind of stuff. But yes, if there's like chronic long-term immune stuff, there's usually also something going on in the gut, and that can really, like, it doesn't have to be a whole protocol. It can be a whole protocol on its own, but it can also just be making sure that we're like reducing the things that are causing inflammation, and then really increasing the things that build a healthy microbiome. So that's just getting like lots of plants in, lots of good fiber in. Our plant flavonoids are what we see as antioxidants, which is like colorful things. Those actually feed our good bugs, and as well fiber. Fiber does as well. So just making sure that you have those types of things in your diet to build the microbiome. It doesn't necessarily have to be a whole weed, feed, seed protocol. I don't know if we've talked about that here before, but like a weed, feed, seed, it's what I call it like a microbiome overhaul. So it's like we go through and slowly start to yes, kill things, but also rebuild and heal and seal the gut back up so that it is actually functioning better and doing a better job. Part of this is also like increasing our gastric secretion. So it can be as simple as just taking bitters before meals, because they've found, so there's definitely studies that have found that just increasing hydrochloric acid in the stomach reduces allergies, it was specifically in relation to eczema, this study. So reducing the presentation of eczema just with increasing your stomach acid. So that just shows that like if we have undigested proteins, those tend to be allergenic. So yeah, just getting our digestion working a little bit better can help us manage our immune responses. And of course, like detoxification is like a big piece of managing something like this as well. So a lot of what we use is like obviously liver function stuff, supporting the liver. You know, we've talked about these before, but like milk thistle, dandelion, artichoke, these are all awesome. But also doing something that is, we call them alteratives in herbal medicine, alteratives or depuratives. They used to be called blood cleansers, but they technically, like, I guess we see them as like they kind of pull stuff out of storage and out of around the cell membranes and kind of bring it out for elimination. Often they are associated, they're either kind of lymphatic or liver type herbs as well. The important thing to note there, that's a lot of where like people like to start, right? They like to start with their topicals and they like to start with their detox. But then if depending on like the state of how your body is and how your liver's functioning and how your gut's functioning, if you start with like heavy detoxification, then you can actually end up having a healing crisis. So this is also called a Herxheimer reaction. What this is like basically like things get worse before they get better. So if you take, let's say like, you know, you start with burdock root, it's a great depurative for the skin. If you start there, you take too much, like you could essentially flare your skin and it can get worse before it gets better. So some people are down for this. Some people are just like, you know, lay it on me and see what happens. It's not my style. I don't like to do that. I don't personally like that experience for myself. I sort of think like the beauty of herbs is that we can be gentle and effective, and we can, you know, you can still wake up and do your day and detox at the same time instead of having days where you're like kind of laid out from your detox. So yeah, and this is definitely like a fairly common thing, especially with skin conditions. So yeah, you just want to make sure that your bowels are open, making sure that your lymphatics are moving. Lymphatics will be an important one in skin conditions as well. And yeah, I would say like because this is chronic and complex, get some support. You know, go talk to a herbalist, someone that you trust, and someone that knows the herbs well. And I think, like we said earlier, like everyone's individual. So, you know, we can address all these different levels, and maybe for you specifically, we actually maybe need to start with a bowel flora protocol and adjust all those things before we can even touch the immune response, because the immune response is so out of whack from dysbiosis. So I would suggest definitely getting some support on something like this instead of trying and going on your own, because you can support yourself for sure, but yeah, I think it's beneficial in something like that's chronic and complex to just get the support and make sure that you're on track and, you know, getting the place to start, and then also knowing when it's time to like move on to the next thing and peel back those complex layers of disease. Yeah, so I think I mentioned a lot of herbs in there. Do you have any other herbs? Like, what are your go-tos that you like to use?
Yeah, all the same. Echinaceas, Chinese skullcaps. I'm glad you touched on the elimination pathways, because that's important too. We need to make sure we're always moving that. That's a question I ask, regardless if I move in the direction of like protecting the gut flora and the barriers. Like if that's my primary approach, I'm almost always putting a liver herb in there to help with detoxification. I'm asking like how are bowel movements. So another thing you can do on your own is just track your bowel movements, track your diet and lifestyle. Like you can follow these. There's probably tons of like diet journals out there. I have my own. Every herbalist or nutritionist has their own. Track what you're eating, drinking, bowel movements. You can tell so much over a long period of time how that's working. Yeah, and then topically. So I almost always recommend doing herbs topically that reduce the itching, reduce the inflammation, and reduce the allergic response. So almost all the same herbs. Chickweed is kind of one of the ones we haven't brought up. We just use that for stopping the itch. It works really well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's so much. I mean, there's so much more out there than I think that we can really talk about in this podcast. And I think if we just throw out a whole list of herbs, it's not necessarily super helpful, anyways, because it's like each of these herbs, we list the herbs, but it's like we'll use them in specific sort of situations. Like astragalus is a great immune support, but it isn't suitable for everybody. Actually, it's same for echinacea or same for Chinese skullcap. So they're all excellent herbs, but they're all differently suited to different people. So I guess that again highlights the importance of getting some support and chatting with a herbalist if you're able to. So I think that's everything that we've got for today. Is there anything else you wanted to add in there, David?
I always say no and then say something. So this time I'm going to say, I think I want to do a podcast on like birthing and like the processes of birthing and all that. So maybe, we're always talking about, we're going to do like our individual podcasts. Maybe I'll do one like that. What about you? Do you have any upcoming ideas that you want to kind of express as well? Because that's kind of like that sounds interesting to me. What about you? What's on your radar that you want to share?
Totally. As I was reading about like eczema and stuff, seasonal allergies has been on my mind because it's coming up, and there's lots of things that people can do to support themselves through that naturally, and the best thing to do is also to start early. So I was starting to put together some ideas to support people through seasonal allergies. So if you're listening to this thinking, oh, a lot of that applies to me, but maybe your skin isn't your main thing, or you just want to dive deeper on allergic conditions, and because if this is you and you're like, oh yeah, I've got the eczema, but I've also got like the allergies and the asthma, or the many things that are associated with immune dysregulation, I'm super interested in doing a deep dive on that. So cool. I think that's in the works for me. Cool. Okay, well, thank you everyone for listening today. I hope you found this podcast to be very helpful and informative. Let us know if you have any questions or any sort of comments, or anything you'd like for us to know or do in the future. If you'd like to work with us closer, we both work with patients one-on-one. You can find all of our information down below this video. So how to reach out to us, websites, emails, Instagram handles, the whole deal. You'll find it in the description below this video. And if you're, depending on where you're watching this, please give us a like or a subscribe or a rating or something. It really helps us to get the word out, and it's also very encouraging to get your feedback. So again, thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.
Take care.